Hello, welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Alex Forsyth. Well, joining me for the duration of the programme, Rushanara Ali, the Labour MP for Bethnal Green and Bow, and Bob Neal, the Conservative MP for Bromley and Chislehurst. Thanks both for being here. I want to start with President Trump's visit to London and his ongoing spat with London's Mayor Sadiq Khan. Here's Bhavani Vadi with the background.
There's been an ongoing war of words between the President of the United States and the Mayor of London, often expressed on social media. The latest spat came during the President's working visit to the UK this week. He attacked Sadiq Khan in an interview with the Sun newspaper, accusing the Mayor of doing a terrible job on crime and terrorism in the capital. This was the Mayor's response.
Nice, Berlin, Paris, Brussels suffered horrific terrorist attacks too. Dozens and dozens and dozens died there. So President Trump to explain why singling out the Mayor of London, me, and not the other mayors and other leaders of countries where there were other terrorist attacks.
Donald Trump's criticisms come after City Hall gave permission for a giant inflatable Trump baby to fly above Parliament Square. And thousands of Londoners were joined by people from around the country to protest against the President's presence in the UK as well as his policies. Mr. Trump also told the Sun newspaper that he feels unwelcome in London as a result of the blimp and that he largely stayed away from the capital to avoid the protests.
But how does this anti-Trump demo in the heart of the capital, as well as the animosity between the Mayor of London and the President of the United States, affect London's image on the global stage?
I think the fact that we've all come out together as a city and really demonstrated against him really does show that we're on the right side of history here.
Well, it shows that we won't tolerate bigotry.
I support the Mayor. I think he's taking a very strong position and he's not joining in with the name calling.
Anybody from anywhere else will know that we'll welcome anybody and love everybody. So,
Except President Trump.
Except President Trump.
The Mayor's critics, though, have the opposing view.
Well, the United States of America is Great Britain's chief ally. And whether you like him or loathe him, Donald Trump is the elected leader of our greatest ally. Having an open spat between the Mayor of London and the leader of the free world I don't think is in London's best interests. Why was Sadiq Khan not doing exactly the same thing when we had heads of state from other countries that have gross human rights abuses that dwarf anything that we could lay against Donald Trump? He's not doing it for that reason. He's doing it so that he can play to the gallery.
The Mayor claims he's voicing the values of many Londoners. But does his continued, highly publicised row with the leader of the most powerful nation on earth help advance London's fortunes?
Bhavani Vadi reporting there. Well, Rushanara, I just want to start with one of the points that was made there. We have had other world leaders come to this country with very questionable human rights records. President Erdogan, for example, Mohammed bin Salman from Saudi Arabia, and yet people weren't protesting in the streets then, were they?
Well, there are often protests against world leaders. We had that, years ago when the Chinese president came along, a number of world leaders. The public have the right to protest against foreign leaders who stand up, who speak against minorities and so on. And in the case of President Trump, I think the point is that he's singled out Sadiq Khan and he's got this visceral hatred towards Muslims and minorities and immigrants and women. And in particular, he's decided he can't stand Sadiq Khan because we have dared to vote in London for a Muslim man who's secular, whose values are British values, who's the first Muslim mayor in Europe or to be elected. And he just can't stand that. It doesn't fit with his worldview.
You're saying that President Trump doesn't like Sadiq Khan because he's a Muslim, so you're saying the president is a racist?
He is, absolutely. I mean, it's well known that he's a well-known racist. He is, more comfortable with the far right. He was supporting the likes of far-right groups in this country. He was retweeting material put out by organisations, I think, like British First and others. I mean, the evidence is there. This man has a real problem with our mayor, whose faith is of Islamic faith. And as Sadiq has pointed out, in America you have a massive problem with gun crime, for instance. Across Europe there have been terrorist attacks. There are other mayors. Obviously it's better that the American president doesn't attack mayors in our cities who are struggling with terrorism. But he's chosen to single out Sadiq. And you have to ask why it is that he's not doing that.
Bob, do you think that President Trump's racist? Do you think that he's singling out Sadiq Khan because he's a Muslim?
Well, I think it's better that neither mayors nor presidents get into commenting on the politics of other countries. And I think President Trump has been at fault in his unnecessary and inappropriate comments about the Prime Minister's negotiation. Thank God she took no notice of him. And also about Brexit. That's not the way you deal with things. In relation to his attitude to racial matters and Mayor Khan, well, there's plenty I disagree with Mayor Khan about. But it is a fair observation that he doesn't seem to have made these attacks and personalised comments upon other mayors. And I don't think America is really in the best position to talk about violent crime.
But the point being that Sadiq Khan has hardly been silent on this issue himself. I mean, he's tweeted, he said that he wanted to hope the president didn't win. I mean, this is a two-way street, isn't it?
Well, I think it's best to have restraint on both sides. I think that's what Gareth Bacon was saying. But I'm not going to absolve President Trump from criticism. There's a lot of things which I find it deeply distasteful about President Trump, but equally, he is the president of our major ally. We do have to have a relationship with him and his administration. I think actually the Queen and the Prime Minister showed how to do it with dignity and constructiveness, but also to push back, as the Prime Minister did, on when he oversteps the mark.
Just on that point, Rushanara, he is the President of the United States, and yet the London Mayor sanctioned a blimp of him in a nappy above Parliament Square. I mean, would you be happy if there was Sadiq Khan in a nappy or Theresa May in a nappy flying above Times Square?
We live in a democracy and we believe in freedom of speech, and we should be careful not to make special allowances for narcissistic people like the President of the US, because they take offence at being at humour. You know, it's a very British tradition to be humorous and to be satirical about elected representatives. If we stop doing that, my goodness, we would be damaging British values.
But think about the message this is sending out about, when you've got the President saying he feels unwelcome to one of the US's closest allies.
Think about the public outcry if Sadiq Khan said that couldn't be allowed. He would be accused of being authoritarian, he'd be accused of sucking up to the American president, even when he is humiliating our Prime Minister and actually disrespectful and ill-mannered towards our Prime Minister. Whatever I may think of her policies, I think it was disrespectful. And likewise to the Queen, not following protocol. It was appalling. I mean, I think that Sadiq Khan and others who stood up to President Trump this weekend should be applauded. And frankly, certain wings of the Conservative Party have been apologists for Trump and his views.
Well,
and
to be fair,
the Prime Minister's response to this, because some people would suggest...
humiliated
just a minute.
Well, no, I think that's absolutely wrong, Rochelle. I think the Prime Minister dealt with what I think was an inappropriate piece of behaviour by the President. With dignity, as she usually does.
Although she did hold his hand, she did stand alongside him.
I don't think she gets much choice in the hand-holding, does she?
Because
this is this guy who, amongst his other very peculiar personal habits, apparently has a fear of stairs and seems to grab people's hands at the first opportunity.
But does she look grab more than people's hands to him? Should she have taken a stronger approach and really stood up to him in a public forum?
I think because we have to have a sensible relationship, and because actually the best way and the British way in terms of diplomacy is not to say everything in public. She's played it absolutely right. It's very clear from the way he backtracked pretty dramatically at the press conference. A good deal had been said in private, I'd suggest,
she didn't,
to make it clear.
Actually, he responded to points about Boris Johnson making a great Prime Minister, in front of her, in front of the press conference, and talked about fake news.
Don't be taken in by that nonsense, Rushanara. At the end of the day, it's what the Prime... Sorry,
it's not my name.
No, but let's get it right in terms of what Trump said. We're old friends.
Well, we all watched
we know that.
We all watched it.
For clarity, what President Trump said is he wanted to do a trade deal with the UK if there were certain conditions met. But just the last point, Rushanara, briefly. Jeremy Corbyn was speaking at these protest rallies. What if he gets elected Prime Minister and has to then deal with President Trump?
Well, look, the Prime Minister could have had an official visit. She decided to have a state visit by the back door. We will have to have dialogue with the American government and President. We have no quarrel with the American people. We do have a special relationship with Americans and America. But I think we need to separate out, and that's what we've tried to do in the Labour Party, between an elected President who is more comfortable with the far right than he is with the Prime Minister.
The Labour Party's got to get a view on what it wants for its foreign policy.
Thank you both. We have to leave it there and move on now. Thank you. Well, last week, the former Labour MP Heidi Alexander officially took over as Sadiq Khan's new Deputy Mayor for Transport. In a moment, we'll talk to her about what's top of the in tray. But first, Jerry Thomas takes a closer look at the challenges she faces.
Top of her agenda, the failing Govia-Thameslink railway franchise that has been backed by the Department for Transport over years of severe disruption on Southern Rail through staff shortages and strikes. In her first major speech, the new transport chief demanded urgent talks with the government to bring substantial parts of the franchise under the control of Transport for London. But would it work?
It makes a lot of sense for Transport for London to run the suburban services inside London. It's done a really good job in terms of London Overground. It's improved the services that it's taken over. The stations are staffed whenever there's trains and so on.
Well, I think most people, particularly passengers on Govia-Thameslink, would agree that something needs to change and change as soon as possible. It's been a miserable experience for them travelling in on that network. So I think there's general agreement that something must change, and I think the government have grasped that as well. They do agree. Whether or not TfL running the service is the answer, I don't think the case has been really made.
As well as the problems with rail, Miss Alexander has to urgently address a black hole in TfL finances, blamed in part on declining passenger numbers. Last year, rail journeys were down 5%. Bus users have declined by 6% over a 3-year period, and there were 13 million fewer journeys made on the tube in 2017 compared with 2016. Additional causes? The Mayor's implementation of an electoral pledge of a partial fares freeze, plus the removal of an operating grant from central government, which had previously stood at around 700 million a year.
Well, I think first and foremost she's going to have to fix the financial problems that TfL are facing, squaring the problem that they've got with £1 billion loss that's coming this way, as well as trying to maintain the infrastructure upgrades that were started under Sadiq Khan's predecessor. I think it's going to be a very tall order.
I somewhat suspect that Sadiq Khan is rather regretting the fact that he promised this fares freeze during the whole of his tenure. Maybe he should have said a year or two, but you know, in politics, kind of a week can be a long time, let alone 4 years.
She also has to implement City Hall's ambition to increase the number of trips on foot, by cycle or by public transport to 80% by 2041. All this while working in an environment with a Labour mayor trying to work with a Conservative government as well as many groups with vested interests across the capital.
Jerry Thomas reporting, and I am joined now by Heidi Alexander, the Mayor's new Deputy Mayor for Transport. Thank you so much for coming. I just want to start with these issues on the Govia-Thameslink line. I mean, this is a nightmare. It is really blighting people's lives. How would TfL taking over make any difference?
Well, I think what we've seen with London Overground and TfL Rail is improved performance, reliability. On London Overground, for example, where we have frozen fares, it's one of the only railways in London where we've seen passenger numbers going up. And I think Transport for London has a really good record at managing these services. And if you look at, for example, a report that was done a couple of months ago called the GIB report, that suggested that services that currently are part of the GTR franchise that run out of Moorgate up to places like Enfield and Welwyn Garden City, plus suburban services from Victoria and London Bridge could be transferred into TfL's control. I think the problem at the moment with the GTR franchise is it's just too big and it's unworkable, it's really unwieldy, and so I think that what we've got to do is have a greater focus on those suburban services coming into central London so that people aren't having their lives blighted in the way that they are being at the moment with Govia.
Have you already had conversations with the Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, about this? Do you think the government should be doing this now, and do you think they will?
Well, Transport for London wants to be sitting down and talking to officials at the Department for Transport. I'm due to be meeting with Joe Johnson, the Rail Minister, to discuss this in the next couple of weeks. But Transport for London is ready to be part of discussions to take over control of these lines.
Are we talking 2020 or are we talking sooner?
Well, we could be ready in 2020. The remapping exercise of the franchise to look at how you might split up different lines into different parcels is due to sort of take place in the next couple of years, with a view to the franchise being let, I think, in 2021, the next franchise. But we're saying we could be ready earlier than that to actually make a really positive difference to people's lives who are
But
let's
I mean,
be honest,
that's
waiting on
years away,
platforms
isn't it?
and
I mean, even 2020 at the earliest for TfL to be ready, people will have to put up this in the meantime.
Well, that's 2 years away, and there are hundreds of thousands of journeys that Londoners are making on the overland network, not the overground, the mainline network going into central London. And so whilst we have a plan around elements of the GTR franchise, what we would also like to look at is the southern franchise and ultimately the southeastern one, because I think that could actually bring real difference to those people that are reliant upon trains and at the moment are stood on platforms and they're having trains cancelled, they're not turning up, huge delays, huge disruption, and you know it's just not acceptable.
I think the problem is that TfL has got financial issues of its own. You're talking about it expanding and taking on some fairly substantial new contracts, but there is an estimated £1 billion black hole in its own budget already.
Well, what we've actually seen happen with respect to Transport for London finances over the last 5 years is we've moved from a position where we had a £2 billion operating subsidy from central government.
But you knew that that was going to be phased out. You had time to plan for the withdrawal of that subsidy, and TfL didn't.
Well, taking £700 million a year out of any public body is going to be a challenge. What we have seen in the last 2 years in Transport for London is us making savings. Over £600 million worth of savings has been made since 2016. It's the first time in the organisation's history that it has cut its day-to-day operating costs, and we're on course over the duration of this business plan to move into surplus. And
was Sadiq Khan's partial fare freeze a mistake?
No, I don't believe it was at all, and I don't think anyone should apologise for freezing fares. Under the previous mayor, fares went up by 42%, and it had got to the point where it was ridiculous for Londoners who were travelling. And so to freeze fares on the Transport for London network, I think was the sensible thing to do. It's about a fifth of the overall impact that the cut of government subsidy has when you look at that averaging out at £700 million a year.
We've not got an enormous amount of time, but I want to ask you about a couple of other points. This pledge by 2041 to get 80% of Londoners walking and cycling, and I mean that will take huge investment in its own right, won't it, with cycle lanes and the rest. Is that realistic?
Well, at the moment, about 63% of journeys that are made in London are made by people walking, cycling or using public transport. So it is a big jump to get that up to 80%. What we need to do, I think, is invest in things such as cycle routes, and we've got plans to advance cycle superhighways out to Greenwich.
That's all money when there's already a black hole.
Well, when you actually look at the amount of spending that is happening on cycling infrastructure, for example, it's at record levels, averaging out at 169 million over the course of this next 5 years. And whilst that is substantial, you know, it is completely doable within a operating budget, a day-to-day revenue budget of £6 billion a year. So I think we've got to prioritise our spending about making the street environment safer for people, making it more attractive for people, improving the public realm around stations so that people are encouraged to be making more journeys by public transport, and that's some of the things that we're going to be focused on.
Bob, I just want to bring in you in here. You heard Heidi mention the cut in government grant. Was that the right thing to do?
I think it's absolutely reasonable to expect a transfer of resource with devolution to the mayor. And let me just make a couple of points. I very much agree with the long-term objective of bringing the overground London suburban train services into the same unified, if you like, metropolitan transport system as the tubes and the buses and the undergrounds. My constituents, like Heidi's were, in Lewisham in South East London, we don't have the tube. We're wholly dependent upon South East trains, and I regret that those metro services weren't brought in. But I think Gareth Bacon made a fair point. To do that, the mayor has responsibility for the budget, and he's got to get the budget in order. And he took the steps with the fare freeze, with other things, with his spending commitments, which don't at the moment give him financial credibility.
Rushanara, just a thought.
That's what we need.
We're almost out of time. Rushanara, I mean, extending the franchise that much, we're talking about going way beyond London with its transport network.
Well, we've got to sort this out, and I think the government needs to stop being hypocritical. They keep doing this. They want to devolve power, but not the budgets, and they want to cut budgets. So then what they do is tie mayors with their hands to their their backs and then they blame them when things go wrong. So what we need is the budget as well as the powers in order to make this work. And I think that's what people want in London. Who does it? The government's failed, so the mayor wants to make sure he can step in and address this issue.
I wish we could talk more about this crucial issue, but we can't. We are out of time. So many thanks to Heidi, Rushanara and to Bob. And with that, it's back to Sarah.